All right, I do have a cold, and you can probably hear it in my voice. David Capes here with the Stone Chapel Podcast. I didn't have a cold when I talked to Gary Habermas earlier about a lecture he's scheduled to give at the Lanier Theological Library on Saturday, November the 9th in 2024, but more about that in a minute. The Stone Chapel Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network, and what we do is we're dedicated to providing resources for church leaders to help them face all the complex things that are going on right now in culture and in ministry. The podcast network supports pastors and ministry leaders by providing podcasts like this, and podcasts about leadership, and podcasts about church planting and other things, and providing insights and offering some practical steps that are going to help church leaders navigate a variety of cultures and context, things that are going on right now. You can learn more about that at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. The founder of our network is Ed Stetzer, and he has a word about some research going on that might be of benefit and of interest to you. Ed?
It's a changing world, and one of the things that help us understand the changing world is research. And so as churches have been struggling and families may be disconnected and sometimes drifting away from the church, we're kind of dealing with some of the questions of where do we go from here? And the Communio nationwide survey on faith and relationships really kind of points to the family decline and how it relates to faith decline in the United States. Actually, the survey has 3 key issues that are impacting our society today. Go to communio.org/study to download the nationwide study on faith and relationships.
Thanks, Ed. Gary Habermas has been studying the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus for a number of years. He's involved right now in a multi-volume series being published by B&H Academic. He's coming to Lanier Theological Library in November of 2024 to talk about what he has discovered. He's going to be delivering the 4th annual John Warwick Montgomery lecture in Evidential Apologetics. You should be here. Yeah, you. And if you can't, maybe you could stream it. So today we get an early look of all that he's going to talk about from apologist, scholar, and all-around good guy, Gary Habermas, on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Hi, my name is Gary Habermas. I am the Distinguished Research Professor in the School of Divinity at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia.
Dr. Gary Habermas, good to see you. Welcome to the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Thank you.
I'm glad that you're here.
Be here with you.
Now, for those who don't know you, who is Gary Habermas?
I think I ask myself that sometimes. I'm living in Lynchburg, Virginia. I know a lot of people live other places and teach at universities, but I'm in the city where my university is. I've had pastoral training, and then I have been teaching college or grad school since 1976. So that's a long time. Just 5 years after I began, I came to Liberty in 1981. So I've been at Liberty for 40 plus years. I only teach PhD courses right now, but I spend most of my time researching. I'm married. We have 7 children. In 1995, the mother of my 4 children died of stomach cancer. And it was a horrendous event for us. She was only 43 years old, and our children were young. Our youngest was 9 years old. And very tough on the family. And then after that, there was a really good friend of the family who lived near us, went to the same church we went to. She was single and rented out rooms in her house to women who were students at Liberty. So we didn't have to meet. We knew each other for a long time. And she was one of the persons that started bringing food over to us. And I guess she brought too much good food, because pretty soon after that, I don't know if we ever dated, but we started kind of hanging around each other.
Yeah.
And we got married
Wow.
a year later. and we've been married for 28 years.
Wow. And you're coming here to the Lanier Theological Library to lecture on November the 9th, 2024. Your topic is going to be the resurrection. I mean, obviously, that's just what you've been thinking about, writing about now for all these years, and you'll be talking about resurrection. So what I wanted to do in our time together, Gary, was to tell people a little bit about that lecture, because we want to whet the appetite. We want all of our Houston friends and people in South Texas to come and visit with us during the lecture. We also want all those who listen out there to our podcast, other continents, other countries. We want them to know about it so they can stream it wherever they are at that time and hear you talking about evidence for the resurrection of Jesus.
My favorite topic in the world, and sometimes I think it's the only topic in the world. To me, according to Paul, it's the main event in the gospel data. And if the gospel data is, he says, 1 Corinthians 15:3, it's the most important of the messages he gave, then I feel I'm right where I need to be.
Yeah. If you could boil it all down and say, what's the big idea of your lecture coming up at Lanier Theological Library in November?
It's on the resurrection, and I presume that I'm going to be doing a lot of it. Talking about the event and what it means and maybe the text and things like that. Presume that most of the lecture will be about grounding the resurrection evidentially, given the theme of the conference.
Exactly.
And, outlining some of that evidence. So in my case, that's unpacking what I call the minimal facts argument. And I will try to take great pains to do a lot of detail on how that argument works. I mean, the first volume of this 4-volume set is already out, and it's almost 1,100 pages, and it's on nothing but the evidence. So if I'm trying to get through that, it's going to be a whole lot to unpack, but I'll try to obviously unpack the most important elements of the research.
You talked about the minimal facts kind of idea, the theory of
Right.
that. What does that mean exactly?
Well, I would define the minimal facts by two primary criteria. The first and by far the most important one is I will not use any facts which are not multiply attested. That's a very important thing, but multiply evidenced. In other words, I will not use any of these facts which are not supported by many historical and textual arguments. As a result, the second point is quite a bit lower down the chart. But the second one is, because I'm very careful about the facts I teach and use, virtually every contemporary critical New Testament scholar, theologian, New Testament historian, I will have virtually no problem going someplace. I do it all the time at state universities, private universities. I'll have no trouble presenting my facts and presenting evidence for them, because the critics are sitting there and they're saying, yeah, I'm okay with all that. Now, what are you going to do with this? And we're ready to move on. In that first book, Evidence, I use 6 primary facts. And of course, when I say 6 facts, each one of them has a load of data that go with it. Mm-hmm. So it's not just 6 facts by themselves, but 6 facts plus the attending data. And when I averaged it, when I was finished this with volume 1, the 6 facts are each supported by about 14 evidences average. So there's a lot of data. I mean, when people are given reasons in books, they often give 2 or 3 for whatever view they're holding. But I mean, 14 per, that's maybe a little hint as to why critics are not objecting to the use of those facts.
Well, there's a number of historians that grant that something, I mean, even if they don't believe that Jesus rose from the dead physically, they grant that something remarkable happened at that particular point. They can't bring themselves to see or to understand this miraculous side of it, but it's hard to deny that something really astounding happened. Otherwise, it's very difficult to explain this sort of rapid explosion of the church in the first years.
Sure. I think you're definitely right. And if you go to the second step, the critics, when I was in graduate school, the field wasn't unified. It isn't unified now like it was then, in the sense that when I was in grad school, Rudolf Bultmann was easily head and shoulders above every other New Testament scholar. And it seemed like most New Testament scholars were either hanging on to him or reacting against him. He was just huge. And to go back to your point about something really happened, I mean, Rudolf Bultmann's there. In fact, in his 1941 essay, New Testament Mythology, which started the New Testament world on demythologization, he says in there that although the resurrection didn't occur, he said it cannot be protested that the earliest disciples had experiences, real experiences, that they thought were appearances of the risen Jesus. And if Bultmann does that, we're off and running. Now we can put the stuff on the table and talk about it. And they'll say, I'm taking it too easy. And I'll say, you're not living up to the data you've already admitted. So that's kind of how it works.
So that's how minimal facts works, and how you put together the evidence to support those minimal facts, or those six facts. And is that represented in your first volume then?
Yes. Evidence is in volume number 1. And volume number 2, which we're hoping will be out before the lectureship in November.
That'd be great.
And volume 2 is on natural theories. And that book is about 900 pages. It's a little bit shorter, but it's 900 pages trying to entertain every critical theory you can think of. So when critics say, yes, I'll give you that, but could it be this? Or yes, but could it be that? I try to respond to all the thises and that's in volume 2. So the combination is of the 2 volumes. This event is highly evidenced. That's why nobody disputes the facts, but it's way more important that the facts are there, not that tomorrow all the critics may not agree with it anymore, but the data are still going to be there. That's the most important. But then I have to have the second one, that all the efforts to say, no, you've got it wrong, are themselves mistaken. So that's why the 2 volumes go together, fact and answering critics. Those are the first 2 of 4 volumes.
Now, what are the other 2 volumes? I know you have that scoped out and planned out. What is volume 3 going to be about?
Well, when I started doing this, I'm an old guy. I did my dissertation back in 1976. I was 25 years old. I was wet behind the ears, and I'd finished this, and I thought, everyone's going to want to know what this guy who did a PhD at a state university on the resurrection, they're going to want to know how I got it past this committee. They're going to be interested. So I better start working on this. And about 25 years later, I started thinking, wow, roughly 1975 finishing, I better stop and do an update on my bib. So actually it was about 15, 18 years later, early 90s, and I stopped just for myself and started putting together a bib of what the leading New Testament theologians, scripture scholars, and non-Christians, philosophers, historians, I started putting a little bib together. And this thing got very long, very fast. And as the years went on, I had 1,500 pages of material, not where I was debating them. There was no debate in them. All I did was say, what does Rudolf Bultmann say? What does Reginald Fuller say? What does Richard Bauckham say? What does John Dominic Crossan say? And I had this huge document, and I was going to do 3 volumes of this set. And someone said to me, why not put your notes out there, everything you got together doing this head count? And I thought, well, that looks good. So volume 3, I think, is going to be used, I'm guessing, the press thinks it's going to mostly be used by MA and PhD students who want a reference volume to where people are on everything from the interrogation of Jesus prior to his crucifixion to the ascension. And then they're also going to want to talk about, what does this mean theologically? What does this mean for presentations of the gospel today? But also, what does it mean for involvement in poor people and helping needs? What's the resurrection say? Paul relates it to working with the poor, and so do others. So what are we doing there? This is a big volume of nothing but views. So you look up the topic, and then you look at the range of views from evangelical to, say, a Rudolf Bultmann. Now, there's not a lot about Bultmann in there. You mostly go back from about 1975 to date, from when my dissertation ended.
About roughly 50 years then.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's a who's who, what, and what. And I don't debate. I make very few comments in there. I'm only telling people where people are and why some people don't like Boltman and why Boltman doesn't like them. It's kind of a running dialogue between the guys, but I'm not one of the dialoguers.
Well, those kind of things are valuable as history of the study of the New Testament. It's focused for scholars, like you said, master's, PhD level, because it gives them a kind of a history of where scholarship has been on this particular topic, which is arguably, if not the most important, pretty much close to the very top.
Yeah. And then in volume 4, some of my critics over the years have said, hey, all this guy does is do arguments and evidences, and he's always on our case because we don't believe. Does he ever stop and do anything pastorally? And very few people know that I did, of my books on the resurrection, there's a lot of them. I did a little tiny book on how the resurrection is the center of theology, and I did a little tiny book on why the resurrection is the center of practice. Volume 4 expands that, and I try to say, okay, for the first time in volume 4, until then, I don't call the resurrection a miracle. I call it a miracle claim. And what are we going to do with this? And that's why there's pro and con. Volume 4 is on theology and practice. So I start with how do we establish a Christian worldview based on the resurrection? Because that's obviously what the people did in the New Testament. They started with the resurrection, and they built this big agenda and worldview. And then after the worldview question, I go on to practice questions. And I say, what's the resurrection say? Like I said, what does it say to people like me who lost a spouse when they were young and don't know what to do? What does it say to people who are pretty old and they've been told they got so long to live? What are their thoughts about the afterlife going to be? What does the resurrection say to death and dying? Questions like that. So that's where I try to tie in the resurrection for the second half of the volume. And the fourth volume has a huge bibliography. And I mean, I've got the best editor in the world. And they've done a great job at Broadman Holman Academic. I live on a little lake here right outside my window, and I feel like it's about time I try fishing with my grandkids and taking a break. So I hope that comes early next year.
I think there's something the resurrection has to say about fishing with your grandkids.
That's right.
There's got to be something there.
Yeah, John 21. We go from resurrection to fishing. So that's the move I'm going to try to make.
Try to make that move. Well, we're looking forward to you being here with us, Gary, and it's going to be a great weekend because we've got other scholars who will be here. We'll have a panel discussion on Friday, but your main lecture is going to be November the 9th, 2024, and we're very much looking forward to it. There'll be information on our website. People can check out, and they can join us physically if they're in their area, and if not, they can stream that. I think it's just such an important topic for people from beginning to end of the Christian faith. I mean, it's the all in all, I think. We're so grateful you've been with us today on the Stone Chapel podcast to talk about this great topic and to encourage us to come and be a part of this. We look forward to seeing you here.
Thank you very much. It's about the third or fourth time I've been there, and every time it is such a thrill. So I'm just glad to be able to see everybody again in November.
It'll be great. Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Stand by for a nugget of wisdom from Dr. Gary Habermas. You know, it's always good to talk to Gary Habermas. Now, the date of his lecture in Houston is going to be November the 9th, 2024, at the Lanier Theological Library. Get on our newsletter if you aren't already receiving it so that you can stay up with all the great lectures coming your way. Thanks to Kathy Capes, Phil Keggy, Jenna Firestone, and Jessica Mauser for helping us produce this podcast. A 5-star rating, that's all we ask, please. Oh, yeah, and please be sure to tell a friend about us. So until next time, I'm David Capes with the Stone Chapel Podcast. Thanks for listening.
You know, if I could say one thing about the truth of the resurrection, it would be this. It's hard to let this sink in, but it's so powerful. If Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead, Christianity is true, and we can handle all the other objections. But if Jesus rose from the dead, the conclusion is Christianity is true. And I think that's a great truth to live with people today.
If you listen to the podcast, you know that I love research. I used to lead a research company. So I love when research helps to illustrate a question we have. And one of the questions a lot of people are having is, how do we look to the decline of the family, maybe the relationship around fatherhood and issues of faith and church? Well, again, the Communio nationwide study on faith and relationships actually points to the collapse of marriage, where resident fatherhood fits into that, and how they all point ultimately to a relationship to Christianity and decline in the church. So visit communio.org/study to download Communio's nationwide study on faith and relationships.